G'day, I'm Owen. This is the official Pub Test podcast, and we are diving into a story today that I find truly horrifying. Perhaps one of the most disturbing cases I have ever covered. And you'll find out why as we dive into this. We're going to Germany, particularly during World War II. And this person that we're discussing was known as the worst serial killer ever in German history. So what happened? Who was he? Let's put it to the pub test. Now, we need to understand what conditions were like in Germany, particularly during the later stages of World War II. See, by 1943, the tide had started to turn against the Axis powers, and the Allies were now beginning to get a lot more traction in the war, for want of a better term. And so Germany was getting a bit isolated and they were getting bombed. Now you would think under those conditions people would bandy together. There'd be this massive bit of solidarity. We're all in it. And that was probably true of the vast majority of people, but there was that minority who didn't take things that way. And there could be varying reasons as to why. One, desperation. Desperate people do desperate things. Because food was being rationed. Life was very difficult, to the point where the German officials said that if you are caught looting, that would be the death penalty. But that didn't stop people from looting, mind you, because it was the case of if I don't go and steal something, I'm going to die anyway, so I may as well take that risk. The other issue they had was so many law enforcement people were being sent to the front lines. So these young policemen that would actually be able to enforce laws, well, they needed them to fight. So there was less police around as well, which also led to opportunistic people. You know, those ones that are going to commit crimes regardless. Well, now with less police around, well, they could perpetrate their crimes with impunity. One particular person, we're not talking about him directly in this particular pub test, but he was the original night stalker or night caller in Germany. So this was during World War II, and Germany had this blackout rule. The idea was at night time, all lights would be off. And that would stop the Allies from easily pinpointing targets that they could then blow up. And this bloke, the night caller stalker, which probably will get covered in this channel eventually, he decided, well, it's dark out, isn't it? So he would go around and attack women. He got caught, but after killing about 11 people. So again, these disgusting human beings that just take advantage of people when they are in a desperate time. So it still baffles me that people would take advantage of situations like that to perform these horrendous crimes. Whatever has gone wrong in their mind, I don't know. But it wasn't just during World War II that crimes had been committed. There were many cold cases of some brutal attacks happening all over Germany that was still on the books during this time. And there was no chance during World War II of getting those cases closed. Particularly with all these crimes now happening around Germany because people were desperate. So the police actually got more powers during World War II in Germany. And we can understand why this is not a good idea. But the police weren't just doing the law enforcement because the courts were really limited with staff. The police were then given judicial power as well. So they could act as not just the arresting person, but the judge to determine your guilt. And sometimes they were also then in the role of executioner, because the death penalty was around for a lot of minor crimes too. So you could imagine it would not take much for just one rogue officer to do quite a lot of damage when they were the enforcement, the judicial, and the executive power too. Now, whilst in 1943 Germany were starting to lose ground in the war, as we've mentioned, that probably wasn't portrayed to the German populace. Like, we know there's propaganda in war times, and so your media, your home media, will be telling you how great you're going. And the fact that there were these terrible crimes happening around Germany was a stain on this particular regime, because they were trying to sell the fact that there was a superior race, and that was them. And yet they couldn't control crime in their own country. So there was a need for a major crackdown, even just to keep the German population from feeling good about themselves, despite the conditions they were living in. And that leads us to the crimes we're talking about in this episode. In fact, they were portrayed in a movie in 1957, and I think the English translation is The Devil Calls at Night. And that movie got nominated for an Academy Award as in the foreign film category. And it detailed some of the crimes that this person perpetrated. Now, we're beginning in 1925 in Germany. Many of the crimes were similar to each other and would remind us of Joseph Vacher, the French Ripper, who travelled around all of France and attacked women on their own and little shepherd boys, and that's how he is mostly known. And that's an interesting story too, which you can check out on this channel. But these German crimes were very different as well. Whilst there were some attacks on women, there were attacks on blokes. And in one particular case, a married couple who owned an inn were found brutally murdered. And I won't go into the detail of the attack, but it was said by the police at the time it had to have been more than one person. They had evidence to show that this was just a vicious attack by numerous people. That was still unsolved. But yes, some of the crimes also resembled what Jack the Ripper was doing in Whitechapel in 1888, with strangulation and then evisceration too. Sometimes theft was the obvious motive, and yet other times there was no possible reason as to why this crime occurred. And yes, also, at times the bodies were abused after death. Still very, very disturbing. But also not always. So the MO, the method of operation of this particular perpetrator, varied so much from crime to crime. But this all came to a head on the 29th of January 1943, when Frieda Rossner in Kopenek, I hope I'm pronouncing all of that correctly, was found murdered in the woods. She was a widow, she was in her 50s, and she'd been robbed of the little bit of money that she had. And her body had been abused. They're not 100% sure if that was before or after she was murdered. So we have an investigator stepping in now. He knows that he has to solve these crimes. He has to put an end to this reign of terror by the devil who calls at night. And the question is, has the devil, this person, made one fatal mistake by attacking Frieda? Because maybe this time he's done his attack a little bit too close to home. Because there was a bloke known in the Kopenek area for stalking the woods. and jumping out and attacking people. Normally, just scaring them. But has he crossed the line this time? He was a big, burly bloke. He was known for harassing women. He was known to be mean to animals. He'd spent time in prison for theft. But he was also known as the village idiot. He had this facade of being a simple-minded person. But our investigator, on March the 18th of 1943, only 6 weeks after the attack on Frida, he brings him in for questioning. And then he's arrested for her murder when he confesses to the crime. But the investigator, known as KK Franz, which I believe stood for Criminal Commissar, something like that. Basically, we would call a detective. So Detective Franz, who broke this case, he thought, I know this bloke's done more than just this one crime, given his history. He skillfully gets this perpetrator to confess to 84 crimes. And we would think that sounds incredible. There's no possible way this bloke could have committed 84 crimes all across Germany without being caught. And yet, this perpetrator knew too close a detail for each crime that only the investigators would know. In one horrific case where a woman was found in her own house, in her own bedroom, this perpetrator, could clearly describe the doll that was found in that room on a chair. You would only know that if you had been in that room. And no doubt doing these crimes would burn those images into your memory. So who was the devil that stalked at night? The man that Detective Franz got to confess to all these crimes was born in 1908 in Kopernik, and his name was Bruno Ludke. Now, his father died when he was young, but the family had a laundry business. And he was delivering laundry as his job in the family business. But he didn't go without controversy just delivering laundry. He was reported for just beating his horse. Like many of these serial, disgusting people, they harm animals. Well, he was doing that. He was harassing the women that he was delivering laundry to. And yes, as mentioned before, he did time for theft. And he was a notorious thief. He would steal or try to get money any way he could. But how would this bloke from a small little town do this reign of terror all over Germany? Well, it's said that he would hitch a ride on trucks. And wherever the truck would stop, he would get out and do a crime, get back in the truck, and keep on going until he returned home. So from 1925 to 1943, Bruno Ludke confessed to 85 murders, 84 attacks, 84 events. Yes, that couple that was so brutally murdered that people thought it had to be more than one. Well, this big, strapping bloke, hiding behind this facade of being a simpleton, had been this terrible, terrible monster. And did go down as the worst serial killer in German history. And let me add one more thing. There is a horrendous monster in this story. Some would say truly a devil. But it wasn't Bruno Ludke, because he did not commit a single one of these crimes. See, the actual true story of Bruno Ludke is totally different. Yes, he was born in this little town in 1908, and his mother said that he had an accident when he was a baby. He got dropped on his head somehow, and as a result, he did have a bit of mental deficiency. He could only do the alphabet from A to F, and after that he had no idea. He didn't really get simple concepts very well. And yes, he did try to thieve money any way he could. Even with the family's laundry business, he would try, and when he delivered laundry, skim money off the top. So when he got paid a bit, he'd try to keep some for himself. But his mum would always catch him, and he would have to hand all the money over. And as regards harassing these people he was delivering to, well, it wasn't that bad. Yes, people thought he was a bit odd, but he was harmless. He was a big unit, absolutely, but he was a gentle giant. But everyone in this little village and town, they did see him as, and it was almost in an affectionate way, as a bit of a village idiot. And they would call him a name which today we would probably think was absolutely demeaning, but he took it in the right way. He never seemed to have a problem with the way people treated him. And it was more of an affectionate term people were putting towards him because they all knew Bruno. And yes, he had his idiosyncrasies. Yeah, he did flog the horse a little bit hard, but it was nothing that really jumped out at people to think that he should be locked up. There was one particular instance which actually highlighted this. And that's what he went to prison for. He stole a cart full of wood. Now, the value of that cart of wood was about $175, in just putting it into perspective. He sold it for $13. He had no concept of really what that cart of wood was worth. And the family were angry with people when he did that, for not just telling him off, saying, Bruno, return that cart of wood. What are you doing, mate? You're being a bit more of an idiot than normal. And he would have returned the wood. And that's what they're saying. Even the police, when they let him go, said, this bloke's not a criminal. He's just a little bit stupid. Now, I know, again, that sounds really demeaning to say it to someone. But back then, that was probably the nicest way you would be referred to as if you were in Bruno's situation. And so they're saying, look, this bloke is... He really doesn't know what he's doing. He's just trying to make a bit of money because then he can go to the pub and have a drink. But he even one time stole a duck. Now, you might think that's nothing today. It'd be like stealing a cooked chook from the supermarket, which I'm not encouraging you to do, but you know what, he's only talking about $10-12. But back then, during World War II, particularly in Germany, meat was very precious. So this was a big deal. And he tried to sell this duck to a restaurant. The farmer found out about it, pressed charges, but the farmer actually dropped the case, so he got away with it. But not long after that, he tried to sell a chicken to a restaurant, same deal. But this restaurant said, Bruno, you're being an idiot. You know, like, take it back. So the point being is, he was no mastermind criminal. He couldn't even steal a duck, let alone perpetrate these crimes all around Germany. Yes, he was known for stalking the woods where Frida was found, absolutely, but he would hide behind trees and jump out and scare people. Now, I can understand that would upset you. It would upset me if this big bloke just jumped out to scare the life out of me, and it probably would scare the life out of me. But other than him finding it funny and people being annoyed, he never actually attacked anybody in that woods. But sometime during the 1930s, he was sterilized. Yes, because Germany at the time, under the Nazi regime, were saying we are the superior race and we have to breed out any deficiencies. And so it was considered that Bruno's mental health issues were a genetic problem. And the family fought that. They said, no, he's not. This is not genetic. This was caused by an accident. And the authorities said, well, we don't care. And he was sterilized, which today, yeah, that was absolutely frightening, but that was a common practice during that Nazi regime in Germany. If you were even slightly off, you were either shot or they made sure you couldn't breed. But you see, Bruno neither had the money, nor the intelligence, nor the circumstance to travel all around Germany and do these crimes. Because in Germany, they had roadblocks in lots of places to try and stop like prisoners of war and anyone else escaping. And so you would be stopped all the way around the country and you'd have to show your ID papers. They never found Bruno's papers anywhere. So if he jumped on these trucks and travelled, he would have been found. And he wasn't. So the true monster, the true devil in this story was actually Detective Franz. What motivated him to stitch this poor bloke up? Well, he was a young, up-and-coming detective. But he had good motive to try and make a name for himself. Because as the tide of the war was turning, more people were being sent to the front to push forth and try and regain the momentum. He would have known lots of people weren't coming back. And it's said that if you could show that you were doing a great job, that would get you off that list to be sent to the front lines, most likely never to return. So when he heard of this case, he found a way of making that very name. Now, there are differing reports how he got Bruno Ludke to confess. One, in particular, is that he befriended Bruno. Now, Bruno didn't have many friends because of his mental condition that he had. I mean, people kept a little bit away from him. He was a bit odd, a bit eccentric. But now here's Detective Franz siding up to him and almost rewarding him for giving information across. Though others say, and it's said that family mentioned that Bruno was told that Detective Franz was going to shoot him if he didn't confess to Frida's crime. So those are two very contrasting ideas about how Franz got these confessions. I actually lean towards the fact he befriended him and rewarded him for giving the information that was required. In fact, he smoked a fair bit, Bruno, and apparently that's what Franz would use to keep these confessions rolling in. Now, remembering there were no cameras in these interrogation rooms, and so Detective Franz was able to feed information to Bruno and then record the confession as Bruno was repeating the details given back to him. And so Detective Franz and Bruno Ludke went on a tour of Germany for around 12 months, stopping at various locations where Bruno would confess to a crime that was unsolved in that area, confessing to those 85 murders. But that is how he knew the description of that doll in that room that we mentioned before. And that's how he knew all the information and details that only investigators would have known. Because Detective Franz told him those details. And there were investigators not very happy about this, because they're saying, hang on, you're solving cases in our jurisdiction. It's making us look bad. What on earth are you doing, buddy? And that does not fit the bill. Particularly with that couple, there is no way it was one person. We've got all the evidence to show it was at least two. Two different people had to have committed that crime against that couple. So why was this not making more news? Well, interestingly, none of this was really making news. This was not hitting the press at all, because Heinrich Himmler himself had a little bit to do with this case. Because remembering, the Nazi regime were trying to portray this superior race, and so these crimes being committed, it would suit if it was someone who was known to be mentally deficient. And so he was more than happy for Detective Franz to pin all these crimes on Bruno Ludke. And in fact, that would give them the proof why their policies of sterilization and everything else were needed. And interestingly, these cases did not make the press until after the end of World War II. And as Detective Franz got to serve as the judge, Bruno Ludke was found guilty. But what is of note is Bruno Ludke would never have gone to trial for any of these crimes, because Germany had a law known as Article 51, where someone with a mental deficiency was basically immune from any prosecution. So Bruno was sent to the Institute of Criminological Medicine, which was a nice way of saying a torture chamber. But it was designed that we want to study the mind of these ruthless criminals and get to know what makes them tick. Now, you can look up stories about what may have happened to Bruno Ludke in this situation. I won't go into those details, but it is truly, truly horrifying. And some of those stories could be made up. Some of them could be real. Regardless, what we do know is Bruno's life for the next 12 months would have been absolutely torturous without a shadow of a doubt. And it was decided by Himmler himself in 1944 that Bruno Ludke's time at that institute should come to an end. How they executed him is also a matter of major debate. In fact, his family were notified of a cause of death, but they were given two different causes. One was pneumonia, I believe, but that's not how he died. It would have been in some absolutely terrible way. I said they took his brain and they kept his skeleton, but both those things have been lost. But in 1946, after the war, and a lot of secrets were coming out, Bruno Ludke started making press. And yes, he got the notoriety as the worst serial killer in German history. And then in 1957, that movie came out. And Ludke's family actually tried to stop that movie from being released, but they couldn't do so. They were saying he didn't do these crimes. No one believed it. Even the actor who portrayed him in that movie, he portrayed him as this evil, monstrous person. And it was years later that he started realizing that maybe not all the evidence is there against him. And he came out in the press because he was a well-known actor over in Germany and regretted the way he portrayed Bruno in that movie. But eventually, and it's only been in the last 20-odd years, that it's been proven that Bruno was an innocent man. But it's said of Detective Franz that he would go into these police stations when he was traveling around with Bruno, grab a couple of cold case files, steal them basically, read about them, and then get Bruno to confess. Again, the reason to stop going to the front line. Apparently that failed for him. Now, again, no concrete proof of this, but it is suggested that he was sent to the Russian front and got taken as a prisoner of war and died sometime in 1945. And yes, he was the true monster in this story, not Bruno. And not only was Bruno unjustly targeted and then lost his life, but all those other people who lost their lives during that time were denied true justice as well. And now there's no possible way of finding out who was the perpetrators. There's so much that I could dive into here, but it just blows my mind that one corrupt police officer was able to sell this story basically for decades. And if it wasn't for the hard work of some journalists and other investigators, then the name Bruno Ludke would still be tarnished in history. But as always, let me know what you think of this one. And if you are wondering what is coming next, I'm going to dive into a Jack the Ripper topic. Not a suspect as such. I think it might just be a little bit controversial. That will be the video out next week. So if you want to make sure you don't miss that one and haven't done so yet, then maybe think of subscribing, and while you're there, it's just right beside it, give us a like as well. But truly, as always, your viewing, your support, your comments, your suggestions is greatly, greatly appreciated. I'm Owen, you've been watching the Pub Test, and we'll see you on the next one.